All right, so is everybody able to see the screen and hear my voice at home? All right, thank you very much. Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you. So, just to continue with yesterday, I introduced the European Renaissance and I mentioned a few points of critique that the church was susceptible to. Namely, there were rising figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin and a few others who, inspired by their new zeal after reading the Bible, chose to critique the church in significant ways. And I gave you two levels, so to speak, that this criticism came from. And so if you look at Henry VIII here on the left, you can see that he was a very wealthy person. And at one time, actually, he was a friend of the Catholic Church. He was even called Defender of the Faith, okay? But as time goes on and his struggles with Rome increase, he eventually cuts ties, right? And he becomes the head of the Church of England, and there is no longer any official communication with Rome. This is to say, Henry VIII's problems were political, okay? They weren't really theological. So all of Henry VIII's criticisms and complaints about the church were about the structure, what he couldn't do when he wanted to. Okay, those were his main concerns. They weren't theological. However, if you look at John Calvin next to him, and Jan Hus, and Martin Luther, who we're going to learn about in a second, they did have problems with the way the church was structured, or the way it was structurally governed, and they also had a deeper level of criticism, which was theological, okay? And we're going to see one of the ways that that criticism sort of works itself against church teaching, okay? So we started with Martin Luther. He was a German theologian, an Augustinian monk, all right? And he was famous for nailing 95 complaints or theses he had with the church onto the church doors in Wittenberg, okay? But he's not just known for that. He's known for other things too. And for instance, one of his major contributions to Europe at the time was he translated the Vulgate, which remember was the Bible, which St. Jerome originally translated. Well, he translated that version of the Bible into German. And so that was a very significant accomplishment that he achieved. By the way, if you were to achieve something similar today, if you translate a major work, that can get you a pretty prestigious job. That can get you a prestigious professorship at any major university when you translate a major work from one language to another. It's a very significant accomplishment, and he does this. He translates the Vulgata into German. The main preoccupation that Luther is going to have for the rest of his life has to do with justification. And that is, how are we saved? Okay, how are we saved? How do we appear before God, and how does he save us? Okay, that is the essence of what he's trying to get at. How are we justified before God? And he has different ways of spelling it out. So I'd like to introduce to you 3 new phrases that sort of articulate what he was trying to get at. The first was sola scriptura. Sola scriptura means scripture alone. The Catholic Church has always said that the teaching authority that the church has comes from 2 places. It comes from sacred scripture and tradition. Martin Luther didn't like tradition. He thought there were problems with it. He thought it was susceptible to error, whereas the Bible was free from error. And so it was the Bible alone, the scriptures alone, that had authority over the faithful, over Christians. It was the Bible, not the Pope, not the bishop, not priests at church. It's the scriptures. And so for him, that's a major claim, all right, that would have shocked many people at the time. They would have possibly felt it a bit liberating, all right, that they no longer had to follow the rules of tradition so much. Many theologians at the time would have said, "Oh, really? That's interesting. I've never thought of it that way." And they would have been very excited by that. Number 2, sola fide. Does anyone know what that means? It means faith alone. Sola fide means faith alone. Martin Luther thought, how are we saved? By our faith in Jesus. It's our faith in Jesus Christ. That is what saves us, okay? That's how we become good people. Now, the Catholic Church, in contrast, teaches that it is faith plus, in addition to, good works that saves you. For Martin Luther, he thought that there had been way too heavy an emphasis placed on what people can do to earn their way to heaven. And so he tries to pursue a more radical approach and say, actually, it's just your faith. It's your faith that saves you. And for him, it's hard to know exactly where faith was located. I choose to believe, and others think this too, faith is located in the mind. Okay, it's located in the mind, and it's an act of the will to believe in Jesus. It's an act of the will and the mind to believe in Jesus, and that is what constitutes faith. Okay, that's sort of how there are many ways to talk about it, but really, faith is something that you believe in your mind that Jesus did for you, and that puts you back into harmony with God the Father, the way Jesus is united with Him in the Spirit. And so your faith is what brings that about. It's not your good works that do that. In addition to faith, it's your faith alone. Number 3, sola gratia. Sola gratia means grace alone. Okay? What does he mean by this? He believes that grace is given as a gift, okay? And here you can hear St. Augustine whispering to him in the back, because remember, Luther was an Augustinian monk. He would have been very familiar with the works and writings of St. Augustine. And indeed, Luther favorably appraised and assessed Augustine's work. But he said there's nothing human beings can do to receive God's grace. It's a free gift. Salvation is a free gift of God's grace. The Catholic Church at the time, however, was saying things like this. It's grace plus the cooperation with that grace. It wasn't like you could just have it happen to you and you didn't want it. You had to cooperate with it. Okay, you had to not work for it, but you had to work with it. And Luther, again, he's trying to, I hope you can see what he's trying to do. He's trying to distance salvation from things that we can achieve on our own. Okay? He's trying to say, no, we actually have to radically depend on God's grace. There's nothing we can do. Whereas the Catholic Church has always said, it's God's grace given to us as a gift that we have to cooperate with. Okay? You can feel the tension already. You can feel the tension that Martin Luther is producing here between his ideas and the Church's ideas, but also as a function or effect of the Renaissance. The Renaissance was very education-based, it was very heady, it was a very intellectual movement, and you can see he's studying the Bible, he's locating faith in the mind, not in our actions, and on the one hand, it's very Renaissance. But on the other hand, part of the Renaissance focused on humanism, and that is, what can human beings achieve without God? The pendulum swings the other way for him, and he says, actually, you can do nothing without God. There's no way you can save yourself without God. In fact, there's not a single thing you can do to help that process along. And so you can see he's very much a product of the times, and yet a prophet against the times. He's a very interesting figure in this period. He's very quintessentially Renaissance. There are 2 sacraments for Luther. Okay, we're right here now. There are 2 sacraments for Luther. The Catholic Church has always held that there were 7. And even though that those 7 weren't really spelled out, everyone kind of knew there are 7 sacraments. Luther says, no, there are only 2 sacraments. Does anyone know what they are? Baptism is one. What's the second one? Starts with an E. It's Eucharist. That's right. So for Luther, there are only 2 sacraments. There aren't 7. There aren't 4. There are just 2. Baptism and Eucharist, right? And that's something he gets from his readings in the Bible. All right. Last point here. And this is sort of a difficult point, so I'm going to try and explain it as best I can. Everyone here and at home has been to an all-school liturgy where they see at the time of the consecration, the priest has bread and wine on the altar, and he puts his hands over them, he invokes God's Spirit, and then there's a substantial change that happens, right? It's called transubstantiation. What is the product of the transubstantiating? What is the right side of the equation there? Yes?
The bread becomes the body of Jesus.
Right, the bread becomes the body of Jesus, the wine becomes the blood, and in essence, the divinity of Jesus is now present in this material thing. The full person and reality and divinity of Jesus are located in these sacred species now, which appear under what they call the accidental forms of bread and wine. Okay. Luther doesn't have a big problem with this, except here's the one thing. He doesn't believe that it's the priest's prayer, which invokes God's Spirit, that affects the change or the transformation. He believes it's a person's personal faith that does that. For example, if I didn't believe that Jesus was going to change this bread into his body, and I consume it, for Lutherans and for Luther, it wasn't really a sacrament because I didn't believe it. If I do believe it, then the change happens. So it is my personal faith that effects the change, that makes the sacrament. Whereas in Catholicism, it's the priest's hands calling down God's Spirit to perform the substantial change. There's even a Latin phrase, ex opere operato, which means it happens, God works through the priest's hands, whether the priest even intends it or not. If the priest is really performing what the church desires in this sacrament. But for Luther, it's the complete opposite. It's my own faith is what transforms the bread and wine into the body and the blood. And this is called consubstantiation, because it is within me that this change is effected. In Catholicism, we have transubstantiation. Something up here does it. In Luther's point of view, it's my faith that transforms us, that creates the substantial change. If you look at these two pictures, can you really tell the difference? I mean, they're different people, and one guy is wearing a ring, and one person's wearing a slightly longer robe, perhaps, but superficially, they look the same. Luther didn't have a problem with what it looked like. He has a problem with what people say is happening. He doesn't have a problem with the structure. He has a problem with what's happening. And he says, no, it's not this person over here on the right who is doing anything. It's me, myself. And so here is a Lutheran priest on the left, and here is the Catholic priest on the right. They look very similar. ritualistically speaking. There's a chalice, there's an altar table, there's a book of the Gospels. I mean, it all is very similar, but with a little difference. Here's another example. They both wear robes. They both stand with their hands even similarly, right? They have similar postures. They both look like, if I may say, serious people, loving people, but serious people. Except there's a difference, isn't there? And this is an Anglican here. This isn't a Lutheran, or actually she is a Lutheran. Luther doesn't have a problem with what it looks like, but he has a problem with what's going on. Okay? And so there's another difference there, okay? Even though on the surface level, things look similar. Sorry, that was from last year. It was Happy Halloween. Huh? Okay. Are there any questions about what I've presented to you today? Anybody at home? Can someone tell me the difference between transubstantiation and consubstantiation?
So transubstantiation is the winner. Catholics believe that the priest's prayer comes over the bread, and that invites Jesus to turn it into his divinity. But consubstantiation, which the Lutherans believe, is that it's actually your personal faith that allows it to turn to Jesus.
That's right. The Catholics hold that it's the priest's hands invoking God's Spirit to effect the change. In Lutheranism, it's my own personal faith. Have I even hinted at, is there a question of real presence? Have I even talked about that at all? No. At this point, it's clear the Lutherans believe in real presence. Today, I don't know. I think that it still holds, but it's still, the main point I'm driving home here is he has a problem with the way it's done, not necessarily what's done. Okay? He has a problem with the way it's done, not necessarily what is done. He has a problem with the way it's done, not what is done. Okay? All right. Are we sure there's no questions? You can definitely expect me to ask you about sola scriptura, sola fide, and sola gratia, both sacraments, the differences between consubstantiation and transubstantiation. Those are all major themes that I'd like you to understand in this lecture. And do not neglect that I've told you how Martin Luther is quintessentially Renaissance, and in some ways how he is not. Okay? All right. Well, if there are no questions, I hope you guys have a wonderful day today. Thank you very much for listening.